The silence stretched across the briefing room like a taut wire, broken only by the distant hum of generators and the soft click of Admiral Hendrick's pen against the metal table. Satellite imagery flickered on the wall-mounted displays, showing heat signatures scattered across the Syrian desert like angry red dots. 12 enemy tanks, a compromised SEAL team. And in the corner of the room, Chief Warrant Officer Kestrel Ghost Thorne sat perfectly still, her weathered flight jacket bearing the faded patch of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. "Gentlemen," Admiral Hendrick began, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years in the Navy, "we have a situation." The room filled with the rustle of uniforms as officers leaned forward. Major Rodriguez from the 75th Ranger Regiment studied the thermal readouts while Lieutenant Colonel Barnes from Delta Force traced potential extraction routes with his finger. But Hendrick's eyes never left Thorne, sitting quietly in her chair like a coiled spring. The mission parameters were brutal in their simplicity. A six-man SEAL reconnaissance team had been compromised during a high-value target interdiction near the Turkish border. Intelligence suggested they were pinned down in a rocky outcropping, surrounded by a mechanized infantry unit equipped with Russian T-72 tanks and supporting artillery. Standard extraction protocols called for overwhelming air support, but the nearest F-18 squadron was committed to operations over Iraq. Time was running short. "The problem," Hendrick continued, his tone growing colder, "is that we need someone to coordinate a complex close air support mission while simultaneously managing extraction protocols. This requires split-second decision-making under extreme pressure." He paused, letting his words hang in the air like smoke. "Our best pilots are either deployed or unavailable." Thorne's fingers traced the worn leather of her flight gloves. She'd flown 127 combat missions across 3 deployments, earned 2 distinguished flying crosses, and held records for precision targeting that younger pilots still tried to break. Her A-64 Apache, designated Reaper 77, had become legendary among ground units for its ability to appear from nowhere and disappear just as quickly. The nickname Ghost hadn't come from her quiet demeanor in briefings. It came from the way enemy forces described her attacks. One moment the sky was empty, the next their armor was burning. But Admiral Hendrick had made his position clear during her last performance review. Women, he'd argued, lacked the instinctive aggression necessary for leading men in combat. They could fly support missions, certainly. They could provide excellent reconnaissance and logistics coordination. But when it came to the brutal calculus of life and death, of making decisions that would haunt you forever, men were simply better equipped. Now 6 SEALs were trapped, and Ghost Thorne was the only pilot available. The silence in the briefing room deepened as every officer realized what Hendrick was about to say next. In the corner, Thorne's gray eyes remained fixed on the satellite imagery, already calculating angles of attack and escape routes that the others hadn't even considered. Her breathing remained steady, controlled, like the rhythm of rotor blades cutting through desert air. Outside, her Apache waited on the tarmac, armed and fueled for war. Hendrick cleared his throat, the sound sharp as breaking glass. "Chief Thorne," he said finally, his voice carrying a note of barely concealed reluctance, "you're up." The words seemed to pain him physically, each syllable delivered with the precision of a man who'd rather be saying anything else. Around the room, officers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, understanding the weight of what was happening. Major Rodriguez leaned forward, his scarred hands clasped together. "Sir, the SEAL team, Bravo 6, they've been dark for 37 minutes. Last transmission indicated they were taking heavy fire from multiple directions." His voice carried the tension of someone who'd been in similar situations. "We estimate 12 T-72 tanks in a defensive perimeter, plus infantry support. Standard doctrine calls for—" "I know what standard doctrine calls for, Major," Hendrick interrupted, his eyes never leaving Thorne. She hadn't moved, hadn't acknowledged the assignment, hadn't even blinked. Just sat there in her flight suit, the subdued American flag on her shoulder catching the harsh fluorescent light. The question is whether Chief Thorne can handle coordination of this magnitude. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes spoke up from across the table, his voice careful and measured. Ghost has the highest precision strike record in theater, Admiral. Her mission success rate is. Statistics are not the same as leadership under pressure. Hendrick cut him off. When those SEALs are bleeding out in the rocks and enemy artillery is bracketing their position, I need someone who can make the hard calls. Someone who won't hesitate when it matters most. Thorne finally looked up from the imagery, her gray eyes meeting Hendrick's without flinching. "Permission to speak freely, sir." Her voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried an edge that made everyone in the room pay attention. "Granted. Those SEALs don't care about my gender, Admiral. They care about getting home alive." She stood slowly, her movements economical and precise. "I've pulled 17 teams out of similar situations. I've never lost a single operator under my cover." She paused, letting that sink in. "And I've certainly never needed a committee to decide whether I was qualified to do my job." The room went dead silent. Major Rodriguez suppressed what might have been a smile. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes studied his hands with sudden intensity. Only Admiral Hendrick seemed unaffected, though a muscle in his jaw twitched almost imperceptibly. "You have 1 hour of fuel," he said finally. "No backup, no margin for error if you fail." "I won't fail, sir." Thorne was already moving toward the door, her flight helmet tucked under her arm. "Reaper 77 will be airborne in 15 minutes. As the briefing room door closed behind her, Admiral Hendrick stared at the satellite feed showing 12 enemy tanks arranged in a perfect killing field. In 60 years of military service, he'd seen plenty of confident pilots walk into impossible situations. Most never walked out. But something about Ghost Thorne's quiet certainty gnawed at him. The pre-flight inspection took exactly 8 minutes, 4 minutes less than regulation, but Ghost Thorne knew her Apache the way a concert pianist knows their instrument. Every rivet, every sensor, every weapon system had been personally verified by her and her crew chief, Staff Sergeant Williams. The AH-64's twin engines were already spooling up, their high-pitched whine cutting through the desert air like a buzzsaw. Williams handed her the final systems checklist, his weathered face creased with concern. "Ma'am, the intelligence package shows significant SAM activity in Sector 7. Those T-72s aren't operating alone." He pointed to markings on his tablet. "Russian-made Pantsir systems, at least 2 confirmed." Thorne nodded, her hands already running through the startup sequence with practiced efficiency. "Noted, Williams. How's our Hellfire loadout?" 16 AGM 114 RS, all guidance systems green. Chain gun has 1,400 rounds, mixed armor piercing and high explosive. Williams paused. "Ma'am, that's a lot of armor for one bird to handle." "Then it's a good thing we're not planning to fight fair." Thorne's voice carried over the increasing engine noise as she settled into the pilot's seat. The cockpit wrapped around her like a second skin, every switch, every display positioned exactly where muscle memory expected to find it. Above her head, the co-pilot gunner position remained empty. This was a solo mission by necessity. The second crew member had been grounded with food poisoning 3 hours earlier. The radio crackled to life as Tower Control established communication. "Reaper 77, this is Desert Base. You are cleared for immediate departure. Vector 270, climb and maintain flight level 100 until clear of restricted airspace." "Desert Base, Reaper 77 copies, departing immediately." Thorne's fingers danced across the collective and cyclic controls, feeling the Apache lift off the tarmac with the familiar sensation of controlled flight. The landscape fell away beneath her as she banked west toward the target area, the setting sun painting the desert in shades of copper and gold. 43 minutes of fuel time to reach the operational area, 17 minutes of loiter time once on station. Then the long flight home, assuming there was still an aircraft to fly home in. The mathematics of combat aviation were always brutal in their simplicity. As the Apache gained altitude, Thorne activated the secure communications package and began monitoring SEAL Team Bravo 6's emergency frequency. Static filled her headset, punctuated by occasional bursts of fragmented transmission. Taking heavy fire from the north, ammunition running low, request immediate extraction. The voice was calm, professional, but she could hear the underlying tension. These weren't just any SEALs trapped in the desert. Bravo 6 was led by Senior Chief Marcus "Bull" Patterson, a legend in the special operations community with over 200 missions under his belt. If Bull Patterson was calling for help, the situation was beyond desperate. The sun disappeared behind the horizon as Ghost Thorne pushed her Apache toward its maximum cruise speed, racing against time and physics toward a fight that would define both her career and her legacy. 26 minutes out from the target area, Ghost Thorne's threat warning system began painting contacts across her multifunction display. The soft electronic beeping filled her helmet as she analyzed the tactical picture developing ahead. 12 armored vehicles in a loose perimeter, just as intelligence had indicated, but the reality was far more complex than satellite imagery could convey. Reaper 77, this is Bravo 6 actual. The voice crackled through her headset, tight with controlled urgency. Senior Chief Patterson's transmission was barely audible through the static and electronic interference. We are in deep shit down here, Ghost. 12 T-72s, plus infantry, plus what looks like a battery of mortars set up about 2 clicks to our north. Thorne keyed her microphone, her voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to flow through her system. Bravo 6 actual, this is Reaper 77. I have you on thermal. What's your ammunition status? Running on fumes, Reaper. Maybe 20 minutes of effective fire. We've got 2 men down, both stable but not mobile. Need you to clear us a path to the secondary extract point. Patterson's voice carried the weight of command, but underneath it Thorne could hear something else, the knowledge that his team was completely dependent on her skill and judgment. The Apache's sophisticated sensor package painted a detailed picture as she approached from the east, staying low to avoid detection. The enemy had chosen their position well, a natural depression surrounded by rocky outcroppings that provided excellent fields of fire. The SEALs were trapped in what amounted to a killing bowl, with limited cover and no room to maneuver. But Ghost Thorne had been in similar situations before. During her second deployment in Afghanistan, she'd extracted a pinned-down Ranger patrol from an even worse tactical position. The key was patience, precision, and the willingness to take calculated risks that other pilots wouldn't consider. Bravo 6, I'm going to need you to mark your exact position with infrared strobes. I'm coming in from your 6 o'clock, using the ridge line for concealment. She was already adjusting her approach, the Apache responding to her inputs like an extension of her own body. When I engage the northern tanks, you move on my command toward extract point Bravo. Copy that, Reaper. Strobes are active. Through her helmet-mounted display, Thorne could see the faint infrared signatures of the SEAL team's position markers. 6 men clustered behind inadequate cover, surrounded by hostile forces that outnumbered them 50 to 1. The enemy vehicles had arranged themselves in a textbook assault formation, suggesting professional military training rather than irregular militia. As she approached the engagement area, Thorne activated her weapons systems and began target prioritization. The Apache's fire control computer highlighted potential threats based on range, armor thickness, and tactical importance. The lead T-72 would be her first target, eliminate the command vehicle, and create confusion in the enemy ranks. But as she prepared to begin her attack run, her threat warning system suddenly screamed to life. 2 surface-to-air missiles had just activated their targeting radars, painting her aircraft with invisible beams of electromagnetic energy. The situation had just become exponentially more complicated. In the distance, she could see the muzzle flashes of small arms fire as the SEALs fought to hold their position. The SA-15 Gauntlet missile system locked onto Ghost Thorn's Apache at exactly 23:47 hours, its targeting radar painting her aircraft with the electronic signature of impending death. The threat warning tone in her helmet changed from intermittent beeping to a continuous, urgent wail that filled the cockpit with mechanical panic. She had perhaps 15 seconds before the first missile launched, maybe 30 seconds total flight time after that. Thorne's response was immediate and instinctive. She threw the Apache into a diving left turn, dropping toward the desert floor while simultaneously deploying chaff and flares in a predetermined pattern designed to confuse incoming missiles. The aircraft's defensive systems worked automatically, but at this range, electronic countermeasures would only buy her seconds. Bravo 6, be advised I have active SAM sites engaging. Going defensive. Her voice remained calm even as she fought the controls, pulling the Apache through a series of violent maneuvers that pushed both aircraft and pilot to their limits. G-forces pressed her back into the seat as she leveled off barely 50 feet above the rocky terrain. Copy Reaper. We can see the launch signatures from here. Patterson's voice carried a note of resignation. They both understood the tactical reality. If the Apache was forced to spend its time evading missiles, it couldn't provide the fire support necessary to extract the SEAL team. But Ghost Thorn hadn't earned her call sign by giving up when situations looked impossible. As the first SAM streaked past her position, missing by less than 100 meters, she was already formulating a plan that bordered on insanity. Instead of continuing evasive maneuvers, she banked hard right and began climbing directly toward the missile site. The SA-15's radar operator, confident in his equipment's superiority, never expected an Apache to attack rather than flee. Surface-to-air missiles were designed to engage targets that maintained predictable flight paths, not aircraft that flew like angry wasps in 3 dimensions simultaneously. Thorne's approach vector took her outside the system's engagement envelope, exploiting a gap in coverage that existed only in the brief window between target acquisition and missile launch. Her first Hellfire missile destroyed the SAM site at 23:48 hours, the armor-piercing warhead turning sophisticated Russian electronics into twisted metal and fire. The explosion lit up the desert like a brief sunrise, casting sharp shadows across the landscape and momentarily blinding anyone using night vision equipment. Reaper 7-7, good kill on the SAM site. Patterson's voice carried new hope. We can move when you're ready. But Thorne was already engaging her primary targets. The lead T-72 tank exploded in a shower of sparks and burning diesel as her second Hellfire found its mark, the shaped charge warhead punching through reactive armor like paper. The tank's ammunition cooked off in a secondary explosion that sent the turret spinning 30 meters into the air. Now she had their attention. The remaining 11 tanks began traversing their main guns, searching for the threat that had appeared from nowhere. Muzzle flashes lit up the night as they fired blindly into the darkness, but Ghost Thorn was already gone, using terrain masking and speed to stay one step ahead of their targeting systems. The dance had begun, and she intended to lead. The second T-72 died at 23:49 hours, its crew never seeing the Hellfire that punched through their frontal armor and detonated inside the fighting compartment. Ghost Thorn had fired from a hull-down position behind a rocky outcropping, using her Apache's mast-mounted sight to engage targets while keeping the aircraft's main body concealed from return fire. Reaper 7-7, that's 2 down. Senior Chief Patterson's voice crackled with barely controlled excitement. Enemy infantry is starting to fall back from the eastern perimeter. Thorne acknowledged with a quick double-click on her microphone, already moving to her next firing position. The remaining tank commanders had begun to understand what they were facing, their turrets swiveling in coordinated patterns as they searched for her aircraft. But tanks, despite their impressive firepower, were designed to fight other ground vehicles. Against a skilled helicopter pilot using proper tactics, they were nearly helpless. The third tank exploded as she fired while in motion, the Hellfire's advanced guidance system tracking the target even as she pulled the Apache through a tight turn to avoid incoming fire. Fragments of reactive armor scattered across the desert floor like deadly confetti, and the tank's fuel reserves ignited in a pillar of black smoke that rose into the star-filled sky. 3 down, 9 to go, she whispered to herself, reloading her targeting computer for the next engagement. Each successful strike was bringing the SEALs closer to safety, but also drawing more attention to her aircraft. Enemy small arms fire was beginning to bracket her position, and she could see infantry teams setting up what looked like portable anti-aircraft missiles. The fourth tank tried to retreat, its commander finally understanding that staying in the open meant certain death. But Ghost Thorn had anticipated this move, positioning herself to cut off the escape route. Her Hellfire struck the T-72 just as it crested a low hill, the explosion silhouetting the destroyed vehicle against the night sky like a monument to futility. "Bravo 6, you have a clear lane to the east," she transmitted, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around her. "Move now while they're focused on me." "Roger, Reaper. We're moving." Patterson's team began their tactical withdrawal, using the confusion and smoke from burning vehicles to mask their movement. But Thorne knew that 8 remaining tanks were still more than enough to pin down the SEALs if she couldn't maintain pressure on the enemy formation. The 5th tank died as she engaged from an impossible angle, firing down from above at nearly maximum range. The crew never expected an attack from directly overhead, their reactive armor designed to defeat threats from ground level. The Hellfire's shaped charge warhead punched through the turret roof and detonated inside, turning the tank into a funeral pyre. But success came with a price. Her ammunition count was dropping rapidly, and fuel consumption during high-intensity maneuvering was approaching critical levels. Mathematics and physics were beginning to conspire against her, the harsh calculus of combat aviation asserting itself with each passing minute. In the distance, she could see muzzle flashes as the remaining tanks continued their desperate search for their tormentor. Tank number 6 exploded at 23:52 hours as Ghost Thorn's Hellfire struck its ammunition storage, creating a secondary blast that shattered windows 3 kilometers away. The shockwave rolled across the desert like thunder, and for a moment the entire battlefield fell silent except for the crackling of burning vehicles and the distant sound of the Apache's rotors cutting through smoke-filled air. "Reaper, that was beautiful." Patterson's voice carried genuine admiration. "We're halfway to extract Point Bravo. How's your fuel and ammunition?" Thorne glanced at her fuel gauge, 31 minutes remaining, well within acceptable parameters for the return flight. But her Hellfire count was becoming a concern. 10 missiles expended, 6 remaining. Against 6 targets, the mathematics were perfect, but combat rarely respected mathematical perfection. "Sufficient for the mission, Bravo 6. Keep moving." The 7th tank proved more challenging. Its commander had learned from watching his comrades die, positioning the vehicle in a depression that limited her engagement angles. Thorne was forced to expose her aircraft for nearly 8 seconds to achieve a firing solution, long enough for enemy infantry to bracket her position with small arms fire. Bullet holes appeared in her Apache's fuselage as she fired, the Hellfire streaking downward to find its target even as she pulled away from the increasingly accurate ground fire. The missile struck the T-72's side armor and detonated, but the angle wasn't optimal. Instead of the catastrophic kill she'd achieved with previous targets, the tank remained operational though clearly damaged. Smoke poured from its engine compartment, and its main gun had been knocked off target, but it was still dangerous. "Damn," she muttered, already maneuvering for another shot. Wounded tanks were often more dangerous than healthy ones, their crews desperate and unpredictable. She couldn't afford to leave damaged vehicles in her wake. Her second missile finished what the first had started, the shaped charge warhead finding the tank's weakened armor and penetrating to the fighting compartment. The explosion was smaller this time, more controlled, but just as final. The T-72's crew never had a chance to bail out. 7 down, 5 to go, she reported, but now her ammunition concerns were becoming critical. 7 Hellfires remained against 5 targets, mathematically sound, but only if every shot connected perfectly. Combat had taught her that perfection was a luxury that reality rarely provided. The 8th tank died as she caught it in the open, trying to relocate to a more defensible position. The crew had made the fatal mistake of moving in a straight line at constant speed, giving her targeting computer a perfect solution. The Hellfire struck just behind the turret, penetrating the crew compartment and ending the threat instantly. "Bravo 6, what's your position?" she called, nodding that her threat warning system had gone quiet. The remaining tanks seemed to have lost track of her, their thermal sights confused by the heat signatures from burning vehicles. 200 meters from extract point Bravo, Reaper. We can see the landing zone. Patterson's voice carried new urgency. But we've got movement to the north, looks like reinforcements. Through her night vision system, Thorne could see what the SEAL team commander meant. A column of vehicles was approaching from the direction of the nearest town, their headlights visible as they navigated the desert terrain. Intelligence estimates suggested this was a reserve force, probably mechanized infantry with their own armor support. The clock was running out. The 9th tank exploded in a massive fireball that lit up half the desert as Ghost Thorne's Hellfire found its fuel storage. The secondary explosion was so intense that her night vision equipment automatically dimmed to prevent damage, leaving her temporarily flying on instruments alone. When her vision cleared, she could see debris scattered across a 100-meter radius and a pillar of black smoke rising into the night sky. "Jesus Christ, Reaper," Patterson's voice carried awe and disbelief. "What did you hit?" "Fuel storage, probably," Thorne replied, already acquiring the 10th target. 3 tanks remained, but they had finally begun to work together, their commanders coordinating their movements to deny her the easy shots she'd enjoyed earlier. "Bravo 6, what's the ETA on those reinforcements?" "Estimate 15 minutes until they reach our position. We need to be airborne before then." Thorne nodded grimly, knowing that 15 minutes was optimistic. The approaching vehicles included at least 2 more tanks and what looked like a self-propelled anti-aircraft gun, a ZSU-23-4 that could turn her Apache into scrap metal in seconds if she wasn't careful. Her window of opportunity was closing rapidly. The 10th tank tried to ambush her as she maneuvered for position, its commander attempting to time his shot with her attack run. The 125 main gun fired just as she released her Hellfire, the massive shell passing close enough to rock her aircraft with its slipstream. But tank crews weren't trained to engage helicopters, and their reflexes were a fraction too slow. Her missile struck the T-72's turret at an oblique angle, the shaped charge warhead penetrating reactive armor and detonating inside the fighting compartment. 10 down, 2 to go, she announced, but her voice carried new tension. 4 Hellfires remained, and she could see that the surviving tank commanders had positioned themselves where mutual support was possible. They wouldn't make the same mistakes as their comrades. The 11th tank required 2 missiles to kill. The first Hellfire struck a piece of reactive armor at exactly the wrong angle, the explosive panels deflecting most of the warhead's energy away from the vehicle's main structure. The tank shuddered under the impact but remained operational, its main gun swiveling to track her aircraft. She had to fire her second missile from an exposed position, trusting in speed and maneuverability to avoid the return fire. Her gamble paid off. The second Hellfire punched through weakened armor and detonated inside the tank, turning sophisticated Russian engineering into twisted metal and fire. But now she was down to 2 missiles against 1 remaining tank, and that tank had learned from watching 11 of its companions die. Bravo 6, I need you to illuminate the last target with your laser designator, she called, recognizing that the final engagement would require perfect coordination between air and ground forces. I'm down to 2 shots. Roger, Reaper, lasing target now. The laser designation painted the surviving T-72 with invisible light, giving her targeting computer a perfect lock despite the tank's attempts to use terrain masking. But as she prepared to fire, her threat warning system screamed back to life. The reinforcement column had arrived early, and someone was painting her aircraft with missile guidance radar. She had seconds to make a choice that would determine whether 6 SEALs lived or died. The final T-72 exploded at 23:58 hours as Ghost Thorn's 12th and final Hellfire struck its turret ring, the shaped charge warhead severing the connection between turret and hull. The massive gun barrel tilted at an impossible angle before the entire fighting compartment was consumed by fire and secondary explosions. 12 tanks dead, 12 perfect kills in less than 15 minutes of engagement. Reaper 7-7, that's all targets destroyed. Senior Chief Patterson's voice carried relief and admiration in equal measure. Outstanding shooting, Ghost, outstanding. But Thorn barely heard the praise. Her threat warning system was painting new contacts as the reinforcement column deployed into combat positions. Through her thermal imaging system, she could see infantry dismounting from armored personnel carriers, while a ZSU-23-4 anti-aircraft gun began tracking her aircraft. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple: no missiles remaining, minimal cannon ammunition, and fuel consumption approaching critical levels. Bravo 6, I'm Winchester on Hellfires. You need to reach the extract point now while I keep their heads down with gun runs. Understood, Reaper, we're moving. The Apache's 30 chain gun was a precision instrument designed for engaging lightly armored targets, not main battle tanks. But precision wasn't what Thorn needed now. She needed distraction, confusion, and enough sustained fire to keep enemy forces from interfering with the SEAL team's movement to safety. Her first gun run targeted the ZSU-23-4, the most immediate threat to her aircraft. High-explosive rounds walked across the desert floor before finding their target, the anti-aircraft gun's thin armor no match for armor-piercing ammunition. The vehicle exploded in a shower of sparks and flame, eliminating the primary air defense threat. But success came at a cost. Enemy infantry had finally acquired her position, and small arms fire began to concentrate on her flight path. Bullet holes appeared in her Apache's fuselage with disturbing regularity, and she could hear the distinctive crack of rounds passing close to the cockpit. Warning lights began illuminating on her instrument panel, hydraulic pressure dropping, electrical systems showing intermittent faults. Reaper, we're at the extract point, Patterson reported, but our ride isn't here yet. Through her communication system, Thorn could hear the distant sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the south. The extraction aircraft, a pair of US-60 Black Hawks from the 160th SOAR, were inbound but still several minutes out. She had to keep the enemy suppressed until the SEALs could be safely evacuated. Her second gun run targeted a concentration of infantry that had begun advancing toward the extract point. The 30 cannon was devastatingly effective against unarmored personnel, each round capable of neutralizing multiple targets. But ammunition consumption was rapid, and she could see her round count decreasing with each burst of fire. As she pulled out of the attack run, her aircraft shuddered under the impact of heavy machine gun fire. More warning lights illuminated, and she could feel the Apache's flight characteristics changing as damage accumulated. The reinforcement column included at least one tank, and its commander was beginning to understand her tactics. In the distance, she could hear the growing sound of extraction helicopters approaching through the darkness. The extraction went wrong at exactly 3 hours when the lead Black Hawk took a direct hit from a concealed RPG position. Ghost Thorn watched in horror as the US-60 shuddered in midair, its tail rotor disintegrating in a shower of sparks and debris. The aircraft began spinning uncontrollably, auto-rotating toward the desert floor as its pilot fought desperately to maintain some semblance of control. Razor 17 is going down, the pilot's voice crackled through the radio, tight with concentration. Mayday, mayday, we are going down hard. The Black Hawk struck the desert floor in a cloud of dust and twisted metal, sliding nearly 50 meters before coming to rest on its side. Emergency strobes began flashing immediately, indicating survivors, but the aircraft was clearly beyond recovery. 8 men, the aircrew plus a 4-man medical team, were now trapped in the same killing zone that had claimed 12 enemy tanks. Reaper 77, this is Razor 18, the second Black Hawk pilot transmitted. We're taking heavy fire from multiple directions. Cannot land for extraction. Senior Chief Patterson's voice cut through the chaos with professional calm. All stations, this is Bravo 6 actual. We're moving to secure the crash site. Reaper, we need immediate fire support on that RPG position. Thorne's Apache was running on fumes and willpower. Her ammunition count down to less than 200 rounds of 30 cannon fire. Warning lights painted her instrument panel red, and she could feel vibrations through the airframe that suggested significant structural damage. But 8 more American lives now hung in the balance, and Ghost Thorne had never abandoned anyone who needed her help. Her gun run on the RPG position was a masterpiece of precision flying under impossible conditions. Threading her damaged aircraft between rocky outcroppings while taking fire from multiple directions, she placed cannon rounds within 5 meters of the concealed launcher. The high-explosive ammunition detonated in a chain of explosions that silenced the anti-aircraft threat and cleared a path for the surviving Black Hawk. Razor 18, you have a clear approach from the north, she called, even as her fuel warning tone began sounding in her helmet. I'll cover your landing. But as the second Black Hawk began its approach, enemy reinforcements crested the ridge line to the east. 2 more tanks, accompanied by a battalion's worth of infantry in armored personnel carriers. The tactical situation had just become hopeless. Thorne made a decision that would define the rest of her career, and possibly end it. Instead of withdrawing to conserve fuel for the return flight, she turned her damaged Apache toward the approaching enemy column and began one final attack run. Ghost, what are you doing? Patterson's voice carried alarm. Your bird's shot to pieces. Buying you time, Bull. Her voice was calm, almost peaceful. Get everyone on that Black Hawk. The desert floor rushed up to meet her as she dove toward the enemy tanks, her finger steady on the cannon trigger. Behind her, American lives depended on the next 30 seconds. Ghost Thorne's final attack run became the stuff of legend, though none of the official reports would ever capture the full scope of what happened in those critical 30 seconds. Her Apache, trailing smoke and hydraulic fluid, dove toward the enemy column at nearly 200 miles per hour while taking concentrated fire from everything the reinforcement force could bring to bear. The first tank exploded under her cannon fire, not from a direct hit, but because her high-explosive rounds found the vehicle's external fuel tanks and turned refined diesel into a massive fireball. The explosion was so intense that it momentarily blinded everyone using night vision equipment, creating a brief window of confusion that allowed the extraction to continue. Her second target was an armored personnel carrier loaded with infantry. The 30 cannon shells punched through its thin aluminum armor like paper, the high-explosive warheads detonating inside the crew compartment. The vehicle lurched to a stop as secondary explosions cooked off stored ammunition, sending the survivors fleeing into the desert night. Reaper 77 break off immediately. The voice belonged to Razor 18's pilot, watching her attack run from his position near the crash site. You're taking too much damage. But Thorne was beyond hearing radio calls. Her entire world had narrowed to the target site in her helmet display, and the feel of her aircraft responding to increasingly desperate control inputs. Hydraulic failure had locked her tail rotor in a fixed position, making the Apache nearly impossible to control. Only her years of experience and an intimate knowledge of her aircraft's capabilities kept her airborne. The second tank got off one shot as she pulled out of her attack dive, the 125 Michelle passing so close that the Apache tumbled in the supersonic shock wave. For a moment, Thorne lost complete control as her aircraft spun through 3 dimensions simultaneously. Centrifugal forces pressed her back into the ejection seat, while warning alarms filled her helmet with electronic screaming. Then somehow she recovered. Muscle memory and pilot instinct took over where conscious thought failed, her hands finding the correct control inputs to arrest the spin and bring the Apache back to level flight. The aircraft was dying around her. She could feel it in every vibration, every sluggish response to control inputs, but it was still flying. "Razor 18, what's your status?" she called, her voice steady despite everything that had happened. "Loading complete, Reaper. We have all 14 souls on board and ready for departure." 14 men who would see their families again, because she had chosen to stay and fight instead of withdrawing to safety. The mathematics of that exchange seemed fair to her, though she suspected Admiral Hendrick would disagree with her tactical decision-making. As the Black Hawk lifted off and disappeared into the night sky, Ghost Thorne turned her dying Apache toward home base, 47 minutes of flight time away with only 31 minutes of fuel remaining. The mathematics were impossible, but she had never been particularly impressed by mathematical certainty. Behind her, the desert burned with the funeral pyres of 13 enemy tanks and countless other vehicles, monuments to the price of underestimating a woman who flew like a ghost. The impossible flight home stretched across 47,